Hello and good morning, friends. Welcome to the CEC-UGC live lecture. Dear friends, with our ongoing series on gender studies, so far we have conducted numerous sessions and we believe that all the sessions conducted for you were very, very beneficial. So taking the series forward, today we would be talking on women's movement in India. Definitely we would be talking in the perspective of the world scenario also, but our main focus would be in context to India. And dear friends, for this very discussion, we have once again with us in our studios Miss Inayat Chaudhary, and Miss Inayat Chaudhary is going to deliver this lecture by giving you lots of examples and lots of information which would be very, very beneficial for you. So, without wasting any time, we would like to welcome our guest, Miss Inayat Chaudhary. Miss Inayat Chaudhary, welcome to the lecture.
Thank you, Geetika. Hello, students. In today's session, we will be having a discussion on women's movement. So without wasting much time, let us begin. Now, let me introduce first as to what women's movement is about. As we will progress through the lecture, I will be first talking about how it originated and how it came into being what it stands at today. So, women's movement arose from centuries of patriarchal oppression. As one knows that women had to face a lot of discrimination and has been facing even till today a lot of discrimination. Of course, certain egalitarian societies do exist even today where the discrimination is much reduced and does not exist at the rate at the level at which it stands today. Further, socio-cultural treatment varies from region to region. That is, women does face discrimination. There is a sense of oppression. However, from region to region, it varies. For example, one notices from northern India to southern India or from the east of India to the west of India, the level of discrimination, oppression, the sense in which they are not able to feel empowered varies. Again, it depends on the societal and the cultural construct, the way it works. Further, now these movements can be based on various ideologies. For instance, it can be a liberal one, it can be a socialist one, it can be a new fundamentalist one, it can be a Marxist one. Let us not go into much detail here. Let us now talk about Neera Desai. She was a pioneer of women's studies in India, who defines women's movement as an organized effort to achieve a common goal of equality and liberation of women, and it presupposes sensitivities to crucial issues affecting the life of women. Now, what I am trying to say here, students, is that when I try to trace the history of women's movement, one can say that it wasn't as new as one presupposes it to be. In the Indian context, one can take it back to a very long time back, that is to the Shakti Cult. Let us look at the Shakti Cult now. Now, what exactly is the Shakti Cult? Now, Shakti Cult was a cult where the goddesses, and even today goddesses of Durga, Kali, Saraswati, Lakshmi, are all representatives of the feminine divine power, which ironically are worshipped despite the gender discrimination. Now, this Shakti Cult, the ideology of Shakti Cult, exists even today, and it even existed long time back during the ancient period. So, one can say, due to this sense of divine power, women somewhere did feel a sense of importance, a sense of strength, a sense of power that came into being. Further, various phallic symbols were also worshipped. Like in the Indus Valley civilization, the researchers have found various feminine phallic symbols that began to be worshipped. Hence, a sense of awareness for certain kind of power and equality began to arise among the women folk. Now, however, one should also understand that India cannot be completely said to be a forerunner of women's movement. Why? Because even though women's movement began to originate, a sense of origination for empowerment, a feeling of empowerment began long time back. It was only in the modern times that women decided to raise their voice and speak for themselves in a collective effort through women's movement. Let us move ahead. In fact, it is for this that the famous critics Liddell and Joshi state, let me quote, The women's movement has a long history in India, much longer than the current second wave movement or even the first wave of earlier this century. The Shakti cults goes back to centuries, and the concept of Shakti, which is the female power principle, was recognized thousands of years ago. In this form, the women's movement represents not merely an oppositional force fueled by anger, a rather negative reaction to oppression, but the development of a distinctive female culture, a positive creative force inspiring men and women alike. So what we have understood here, that women's movement can trace its origin to much earlier times, that is the Shakti cult or the phallic symbols which were found during the Indus Valley civilization. Even the goddesses that were worshipped during that time, lot of them were female entities. Let us move ahead. Now let us come to the medieval times. Here, students, I was talking about the ancient times, which again lays a strong foundation for women to speak for themselves, to feel a sense of empowerment. The medieval times also saw various situations, various time periods where women began to speak for themselves. Now here let me speak about Bahina Bai. She is believed to be the first women autobiographers in India. She wrote Atmanivedana. What is interesting to note here is that in this work there is a voice of protest and dissent, which came at a time, let us see student, this was the medieval time, so which came at a time when no women dared to raise their voice. She openly argued through her work for gender balance, where men and women should get equal opportunity. At the same time, she was also open against the gender prejudice depicted in the ancient scriptures like Purans and the Shastras. She asserted her claim of this equality by arguing that one could attain truth and other spiritual aspects of life only by adhering to these aspects. So in the medieval times, she was the first women autobiographers. Now another important trend was picking up in medieval times, which we all know, the Bhakti Moment. The Bhakti Moment saw many strong female personalities like Mirabai, Lal Ded, Andal, who through their devotion to God by means of Nirgun or Sargun Bhakti also highlighted that women too are equal in the society. So this was about the ancient and the medieval time period, as I have traced. So now let us move on to the divisions of the movement. Now several critics have given various kind of divisions to divide the women's movement on a natural basis in a generalized sense. So let us look at the divisions. Many critics divide the movement differently. Gail Omved in 1978 considered the women movement, which could be divided into 1, women's equality movement, and 2, women's liberation movements. Similarly, we have Jana Everett, who cites 2 kinds of women's movement. One is the corporate feminism and 2 is the liberal feminism. For Kalpana Shah, it is 1, moderate or women's right position, 2, radical feminism, and 3, socialist feminism. Sangari and Ved consider the division into 1, modernizing of patriarchal mode of regulating women, and 2, democratizing of gender relations both at home and the workplace. And in a more generalized sense, one can divide the women's movement into periods or waves. And this is something which we all know. 1, in India, the women's movement is divided 1 into social reform movements during the freedom movement period, 2, the movements from 1947 to 1975, and 3, the movements emerging during and after the International Women's Decade. Now let us begin with the social reform movement. First, I spoke about the Shakti Cult, that is during the ancient period. I traced how the origin of women's movement could be traced back to the ancient time, then to the medieval times, and now I'm coming to the social reform movement period, which is roughly the 19th century or the early 20th century. Now, we all know what the social reform movement was. It had prominent figures like Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, who played a significant role in upliftment of the women. Now, what were the issues that were discussed and criticized during this period? These were widow remarriage was an issue which was brought forward by various prominent figures during that time, primarily Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar. The second was the issue of sati. The third was child marriage. And early widowhood was another issue. Similarly, polygamy, having more than one wife, was again criticized by the social reformers during that time. In fact, what happened in sati? Sati was the burning of a widow on the funeral pyre of her husband. Similarly, widows also had to go through a lot of discrimination. They had to get their heads tonsured, they had to wear white clothes, they were not allowed to be a part of festivities, they were considered to be a bad omen, they were given minimum food. Hence, the position of women during the 19th century was very pitiable and one of suffering. Interestingly, what is the interesting thing that we note here? We note here that the women's issues were raised and spearheaded by none other than men. Who are these men? These men were educated men with liberal thoughts who wanted to bring equality in the society. And as I have spoken about, these were none other than the famous figures during the 19th century, Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, Jyotirao Phule, and many more. So here I am talking about what exactly sati was. What happened during sati? Now, the sati is derived from the original name of the goddess Sati, also known as Dakshani, who self-immolated because she was unable to bear her father Daksha's humiliation of her living husband Shiva. However, the great step that was taken during the social reform movement was due to the extensive efforts of Raja Ram Mohan Roy, due to which on 4th December 1829, sati was banned under Bengal presidency by Lord William Bentinck. In fact, Raja Ram Mohan Roy, through his work Sambad Kambudi, wrote several articles and showed that it was not written in any Veda or any ancient scriptures which spoke about sati, which should be committed when the husband died. Similarly, Pandit Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, due to his extensive several efforts that he undertook, led to the enactment of Hindu Widows Remarriage Act of 1856. He also opened 35 girls' schools which were inspired from Bethune School, which was in fact the first girls' school in Calcutta. The year 1854 brought the Woods Dispatch, which too laid stress on women's education. Now, another important aspect that we note during this period is the idea of Bhadralok. Who were the Bhadralok? Bhadralok were the newly emerging middle class of Bengal who believed in education. The Bhadra Mahila wanted to be educated. The Bhadra Mahila wanted to change things for herself. She wanted to feel empowered. So this was another important action or the enactment of a situation when women tried to raise their voice, tried to feel equal, started to feel empowered, and laid strong foundation for several women's movements which would begin in the future. Similarly, again it is important to note that women as well as men both played an active role. Of course, men played a much more active role than women, but there were several women who spoke for themselves. Students, if one needs to gain more knowledge of the women's position during this period, that is the 19th century, the late 19th century, the entire stretch of 19th century and the 20th century, one can look at Neera Desai's, I have quoted it in the slide, Neera Desai's work, Women in Modern India, which has chapters on social reform movement, as well as Usha Chakravarti's work, Conditions of Bengali Women, around second half of 19th century. Now, like I said, the social reform movement did see some exceptional men who played an important role in upliftment of women. But of course, there were also certain women who helped in raising the voice, in talking about, in bringing to the limelight the discrimination which was faced by women. And one of such figures was Rasa Sundry Devi, who wrote her autobiography in 1876, known as Amar Jeevan. She, in fact, never attended formal school, and through her work, powerfully demonstrated the sad and pitiable position women occupied during her time. Therefore, she gave a call to women by the medium of her work to stand up for their rights. Similarly, we have another important female figure, Swana Kumari Devi. Students, many of you don't know that she was none other than Rabindranath Tagore's sister. She commenced and began the Ladies Theosophical Society in 1882. Similarly, her daughter Sarla Devi played an important role by starting training the women in the use of sword and lathi in 1903. We also have Pandita Ramabai as a significant example. She belonged to an affluent Brahmin family, and she played a significant role in setting up of various women's organizations, school for girls and home for widows. Apart from writing her renowned book, The Hindu Caste, Hindu Women. This book, in fact, was very significant in changing the way how women thought during those times. Now, in this table, I am roughly talking about the initiatives that were taken during that time. These initiatives were chiefly significant because these initiatives changed the way and helped in empowering the women of that time. So let us look at the table. In 1848, Savitribai Phule founded first women's school in Pune. In fact, she was the forerunner in opening schools for educating lower caste women. 1904 as a year was significant because the National Social Conference, a women's wing, was opened in it, the Indian Women's Conference. 1916 saw two important events that took place. One was the All India Muslim Women's Conference, which was commenced by Begum of Bhopal, and the prime purpose, of course, was to educate the women, to make them feel empowered and strong. Similarly, it also saw the opening of India's first women's university by D.K. Karve. It was named after his mother and still has the same name now, Srimati Damodar Nathi Bai Thakarse Women's University, in short, SNDT Women's University. Let us look at the next year, 1917. This was also significant because during this time, Women's Indian Association associated with British Women's Movement for Suffrage, and it was started by Margaret Cousin, Dorothy Gina Dasa, and Annie Besant. 1925 was another relevant year because National Council of Women, founded by Lady Tata and Lady Aberdeen, which was a branch of the International Council of Women, was something that came into existence. 1927, All India Women's Conference was set up by Margaret Cousin, which later merged with the Women's India Association in the 1930s. And finally, in a generalized sense, one can say that from 1880s to 1940s, the first wave of feminism for women's movement in India came into existence, as per the famous critic Geraldine Forbes. Now let us look at what exactly was happening in the 19th century. A significant point that one can make here is that though men played an important role, as I said before, in the emancipation of women, now a certain change began to be seen. That was the wives, the daughters, the sisters and followers of several male leaders were equally active and attempted to improve the conditions of women. Similarly, it is believed that by many that this awakening was primarily due to the entry of the colonialism period or the entry of the Britishers, who, because of the kind of education, the English education system which was introduced by Lord Macaulay, did have an emphatic effect in making women feel empowered, because it provided education to women and it made the women think that they did belong to this society at an equal par with that of men. However, we also have a very important and interesting thing to note here, that there are certain critics who felt that it was not primarily because of the British efforts. It was also because of the events that took place in the indigenous movements during that time, because of which the women began to feel empowered, began to stand up for themselves. Now, what were these indigenous movements? Now, these indigenous movements can be traced to various time periods, like it can be demonstrated in the state of Travancore Cochin in southwest India, the state of Mysore and the state of Baroda, where women were highly educated and were employed into several professions. Similarly, this period also saw Brahmo Samaj and Arya Samaj. This was also significant in its own way. Why? Because Brahmo Samaj promoted education and autonomy for women, whereas Arya Samaj encouraged martial arts to women. Now, another important significant aspect to note here is the whole debate between the public and the private sphere. What one notices is that in the public sphere, issues regarding the public sphere like women's suffrage was debated upon by men. But when it came to private sphere, so for instance, issues regarding the inheritance or the Hindu code bill, not much was done about it. Why? Why nothing was done about it? This is because the Hindu code bill posed a challenge to male domination of the Indian society in the household hierarchy, and it is for this that not much was done about it, even though the British, the colonial people, took it strongly. So it is for this that Jana Madsen Everett strongly notes in her work Women and Social Challenge in India that how issues, let me quote from here, which critique the domestic or private lives such as marriage and inheritance faced much resistance, while issues concerning political or economic life such as suffrage and employment were received with less resistance from the male population in pre-independent India. So it is significant to note the debate that existed between the public and the private sphere. Another reason why issues regarding the public sphere were strongly spoken about was because in the public sphere, the example of women's suffrage was fought for. Why was it fought for? Because it added to representation of the Indians, which again posed a threat to India, to the British, as the representation of Indians increased. Now, several other works that were written during this period by various famous women writers were Sultana's Dream, written by Ruqayya Shekhawat Hussain in 1905, which is a feminist utopian story. Similarly, Pandit Ramabai's work and Tarabai Shinde's work, Stree Purush Tulna, was another significant works that brought about and made the women feel and sent a message for the women to feel strong and feel empowered. In the late 19th century, several women wrote in Hindi. Thus, there was a growing sense of female autonomy and feminist consciousness that began to be witnessed during this time period. Mahatma Gandhi also had championed several liberal ideas of freedom and individual rights, and in the freedom struggle, when one looks at the freedom struggle moving on from the social reform movement, one notices that women stood up for themselves and actively took part in in the oppression that was being faced by the Indians as well as the Indian society. Therefore, the women now began to take active part in the freedom struggle. Now, before I end this session, I would like to speak about a significant quote which depicts how the times had begun to change when it came to the position of women. It is none other than the famous Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru through his work, Discovery of India, famously quotes, "Most of us men folk were in prison, and then a remarkable thing happened. Our women came to the front and took charge of the struggle. Women had always been there, of course, but now there was an avalanche of them, which took not only the British government but their own menfolk by surprise. Here were these women of the upper or middle classes, leading sheltered lives in their homes, peasant women, working class women, rich women, poor women, pouring out in their tens of thousands in defiance of government order and police lathi." So students, in this session, I traced how the women's movement actually came into being. So I spoke about the ancient period where one sees a lot of ideas which can be traced as to how women began to feel empowered, the medieval period, the social reform movement, as well as the freedom struggle movement. In the next session, I will be talking about the post-independence period and how women's movement strongly came into existence and strongly began to raise their voice against the continuous oppression being faced by being a part of the society. As well as I will be talking about the women's movement with respective to the world, how it existed in the world. So for now, students, thank you and see you in the next session. Hello students, in the last session I had spoken about women's movement and I had tried to trace the origins, the ideas which were responsible for laying a strong foundation of women's movement that exists today. These ideas were traced from the ancient period, followed by the medieval period, then the modern times, that is before the pre-independence period, which included the social reform movements era, that is roughly the period of 19th century, as well as the freedom struggle movement. Now, in the coming session, I will be talking about the period which is and responsible for greatly enhancing women's movement. So here we are talking about post-independence period, followed by also at a look of women's movement that exists and the way they worked in the world today and their origin, the historical origin. So let us begin. Now here, what is important to see is the Western versus Indian debate. This is an important aspect which the students should carefully look at. Now several critics, I also discussed a bit about it in the last session. Several critics feel that the women's movement has Western strings, origin of Western strings attached to it. Yet at the same time, there are those who feel that the origin of women's movement is completely Indian. In the Indian context, they originated from India. This is what a lot of critics feel. So these are the two sides and the two views that one sees when it comes to women's movement. Now let us look in detail, and I will be referring to the slide right now. So in the slide, one notices that during the initial stage of growth of women's movement in India, the material which was used to disseminate information about these organizations like posters, handouts, campaign charts were in English. Now this resulted in uproar from many sections of society, considering it to be an alien concept. Now again, these posters which were in the language of English, and during that time the languages that were in prominence were of course the regional languages, Hindi, the famous Urdu language. However, when women's movement began, the message that the women's movement tried to convey and began to be propagated through various mediums was in English, it was believed that this is an alien concept because English immediately gets associated with the Western world. Many also felt that the idea of social change that women's movement tries to introduce is again very Western. Now, why is it Western? Why is this idea of change Western? This is primarily because when one talks about women's movement, one sees that the women's movement tries to dismantle the existing societal understanding of the way the Indian society works. So it attempts to change things. In the similar manner, it is believed when the British people, when we were colonized by the British, they too attempted to change the social systems of the Indian society. So both the changes are equated together. So when British tried to introduce the change, that was seen as negative. And in the similar way as English language, the language that is used to disseminate information about women's movement is again completely associated with Western. It is again seen to be negative, an alien concept, and it is not received well by many. Now, again, what is important to note here is the concept of tradition. Now, this concept of tradition is a distinct one. So, to avoid this kind of debate from arising, there were a lot of critics who were in favor of women's movement. What they tried to do was that they tried to propagate the idea of women's movement by following by promoting a sense of traditional values. Of course, not the ones of the traditional structure which are oppressive for women, but they try to associate with themselves with positive traditional values of the Indian society. They were trying to determine and show that women's movement is more of Indian than Western. Now, in the same way as one notices that there were certain aspects where one again notices aspects which made the whole idea, the whole politics of change, which made the movement very Western and alien. So, like I spoke about the idea of tradition, through the idea of tradition, what they tried to do was that they were again very careful from stereotyping the whole idea of women goddesses. So they try to show, through their women's movement, they try to propagate a sense of women empowerment by talking about that since ancient times there were many goddesses, like the idea of Shakti Cult, and they spoke about it, and it's been since a lot of ages that women have had a very important role in the society, which they try to show through these goddesses, as I just said. But they were very careful in not stereotyping it. So, both the sides, one side tried to show that women's movement is anti-men. Women's movement began to be labeled as Western. Women's movement began to be labeled as alien. However, this another side tried to show that women's movement is a lot of times can be associated with anything that is very traditional and did have its origin in the Indian society and was less of Western, anything Western that was associated with it. So this was something where I spoke about the Western and the ethnic, that is the Indian debate which existed when one speaks about the women's movement. Now, when one looks at post-independent period, one notices that during this time, when we got freedom, a constitution was drafted and written down, and one notices there are a lot of articles which spoke about equality. So at that time, the need was not, there was no need felt that, a sense of there should be revolt and protest that, there is no equality, because this issue had already been dealt with in detail from the constitution. And it was assumed that since, it is written, it is in legal format, in the future, women can and will feel much more empowered and encouraged in the position that they occupy in the society. However, when one proceeds towards the mid 1960s, things began to change. As issues of poverty came to the forefront, unemployment came to the forefront. The people grew disillusioned with the policies that were propagated by the government, the economic rights, the land rights, and the price rise issues that shook the nation. And this is when lot of movements, apart from not just women's movement, but lot of women to fight for their rights came into being. So, for instance, a lot of peasant movements came into being. In the early 1970s, one sees the anti-price rise agitation in Bombay and Gujarat between 1972 and 1975. Again, in the Chipko movement came into existence in 1973. Similarly, one of the important movements regarding the women that took place during this time was the agitation such as the Shahada agitation and the eventual formation of the Shramik Sangathan in the 1970s of the Bhil landless laborers against the exploitative landlords, which was triggered off after the painful rape of 2 Bhil women. Now, similarly, the period also saw that issues such as family violence, wife beating, alcoholism coming to limelight in a more, people began to protest against these issues. People raised these issues. There is a sense of equality which now needs to be introduced in the society, because all these negatives are, halting the progress of the nation. If the half of the population is not feeling empowered, then there is no way that the nation can progress. And so, all these issues began to develop and change the way the Indian society thought. And these issues were primarily raised by various movements, as I discussed. Now, in this table, I am trying to show the important years which again changed the way the Indian society worked. So 1972 saw Seva movement in Ahmedabad led by Ila Bhatt come into existence. Let us look at the slide to have a clear idea of what is happening. In 1972, Seva movement in Ahmedabad led by Ila Bhatt was introduced. It was first of its kind where Women's Trade Union, which was a landmark in women's movement, came into existence. Now, what happened during Women's Trade Union? Issues like low wages, safety issues, exploitation by contractors, the status that the laborers were given, all these issues were highlighted. The harassment which was faced by the laborers or by the informal working sector through police and contracts, all these poor working conditions, all these issues were highlighted. So, these movements brought together, collected together women from various spheres of life where they could protest in a collective manner, in a systematic manner, and raise their issues. 1974 was another important year because, again, another important movement was started during this period. It was against corruption. It also critiqued the caste system, the religious rituals, the political and economic issues, and as well as the private sphere issues like family violence, domestic roles, and patriarchal stereotypes. The same year saw the progressive organization of women come into being. Again, this dealt with gender oppressive structure, and it completely opposed the economic dependence of women on men, and it kind of sent a message for women to stand up for their rights, to stand up and fight for their rights. It kind of made them feel empowered. Similarly, a significant step was taken at the United Nations, which in 1975 and 1985 declared this entire decade as the International Decade of Women and organized the World Conference on Women in Mexico. The whole idea of World Plan of Action stressed the need for research, documentation, and analysis into various aspects of society that created this sense of gender inequality. In India, one notices the formation of the National Committee on the Status of Women. Eventually, the committee came out with a report which was popularly called Towards Equality Report of 1974, a major achievement for the women movement. Now, responding to both the findings of Towards Equality Report and the United Nations call for action, the government of India drew up the plan of action for the country. One notices the Indian Council of Social Science Research took forward the research in this area strongly, and after Towards Equality Report, several micro-studies were conducted all over the country. In 1975, women's study, which is a new field, was introduced in the Indian university system. Why this year was chosen? This year was chosen because of the way the women's movement came into being. And perhaps this was the year where the awareness reached its highest realm, making it a need to do more research, analysis, documentation on issues specifically related to the women's movement. And therefore, a separate field of women's study was introduced. Similarly, the first national conference on women's studies was held in 1981, which of course very openly spoke about the gender inequality that existing during the society. So student, gradually as you notice, post-independence, women's movement played an important role in bringing together, in making the females feel more empowered. Just like the social reform movement and the freedom struggle kind of introduced a sense of belonging to the society, to stand up for not only for the rights but also for the nation. In the same way, the post-independent era saw a lot of females trying to educate themselves, and it was by education that more awareness and they could ponder more upon their life and see how they were different or being discriminated upon as compared to men in the society, in the Indian society that they lived in. Now let us move ahead. Now another important aspect that I would like to show here is and discuss here is that post 1975 saw the idea of autonomous organizations coming into play. Now we know that autonomy was not a new concept, as during the freedom struggle one saw it very clearly due to the idea of Gandhi that was portrayed, where the concepts of freedom, independence and equality were being championed by him. Now, many of these autonomous groups, what is interesting to note here, students, is that women's movement received a lot of criticism on several areas. There were areas which tried to pull them down, be it the debate, the Western versus the Indian debate, which was a way to pull it down, which was a way to not let the women know what they stood for. Then there were other ideas, just like these autonomous groups were viewed negatively by society. They were it was believed that they are anti-male. A lot of left parties also considered to be anti-male, even though a lot of them did ally themselves with the left parties and the trade unions, while maintaining the same time their distinction on the ground that the other organizations were patriarchal in their structure. So, these autonomous organizations post 1975 took an important role in demonstrated in bringing out aloud the position, a sense of make the women feel a sense of empowerment to raise their voice against the injustice which was being done against them on several issues. Now, these autonomous organizations, as I'm quoting Nandita, Gandhi and Shah, talk about them that they, in the current phase, could be in the form of support groups, could be agitational groups, grassroots groups, wings of political parties, professional women group, research and documentation center, or anything. So, autonomous organizations were divided into various kind of structures. And the purpose of all of them was one, to empower the women, to talk about all those issues which discriminated, which made the women feel low as compared to the men in the society, which questioned the whole hierarchy where the men occupied the highest position and the women occupied a much lower position. So, another important aspect that one can talk about here is that though this was a very important step, yet all these organizations were mainly urban. So, what I understand from here is, this is my personal perspective, that it was gradually that women's movement came into existence. They began with the urban areas, the urban arenas, and then I think gradually they began to shift towards the rural areas. So a lot of NGOs, women organizations also started to come up in rural areas too. But as of now, during this period, the 1970s onwards, it was chiefly the urban period where one could see it. Of course, there were some in rural areas too, and which worked full-fledgedly over the complete development of the status of women in all realms of society, whether they belong to any caste or class. But what is important to note here is that it was mainly concentrated onto the urban arenas of the society. Now, as we move from 1970s and come into 1980s, several important events took place. One was the Shah Bano case. The other was the Sati of Roop Kanwar, then the Mandal agitation that demonstrated how the whole idea of women's issue is very complicated, because it got into place the working of other dimensions also, like that of caste, the class, and the ethnic issues also became involved and became an important issue in the women's movement. In fact, it was during this very time in the 1980s that a nationwide campaign was held on dowry and the issue of rape, which led to the formation of the Forum Against Rape and later the Forum Against Oppression of Women, followed by the Supreme Court judgment in the Mathura case in the late 1970s, which brought isolated protests across the country together with one voice on the issue of violence against women. Similarly, now as we progress, so in the post-independence era, we were looking at that during the initial time of the post-independence era, not much was done because it was believed that the legal structure will help to inculcate a sense of empowerment, will bring about equality, the various articles that are present within it. But when the people who wanted to bring about equality in the society realized that not much was being done or not much was being achieved, they began various organizations. And of course, the situation of those times, like the 1960s, saw poverty coming into play. So an important concept that comes to my mind is the whole idea of feminization of poverty, which was spoken about. That is, it was believed that half of the population that is poor is no one else but the women. So it became very important, to make the women feel empower, which itself would reduce the whole concept of poverty too. Similarly, people were not employed, they were not satisfied with the government policies. So this was the period of 1960s. When one came to 1970s, one witnessed other issues which I discussed right now. Then in the 1980s, episodes of Sati, the episode of Sati committed by Roop Kanwar, the Shah Bano case came into play. And finally, when one comes to 1990s, a different kind of aspects come into play, that is the socio-economic and political realities which are the new challenges concerning this field. For instance, liberalization is increased, globalization comes into existence, there is a concept of free market economy, as well as the growing religious conservatism also is an important issue which begins to start working during this period. And the whole idea of welfare state, which once did exist, is completely now vanished, stands completely eroded. Now, like I said, the feminization of poverty became an important issue during this time period. There was a sense of uncertainty with LPG reforms that came into play. So, the women's movement not only came into action, but it also progressed and changed itself according to the needs and the times that existed in the Indian society, like I have traced from the several years. So there were ideas like environment issues, destruction of environment, which again became very important. The religious fundamentalism also became very important. Now, like I spoke before, the law and legal reform was a significant aspect for women activists, because this was something that made the women feel empowered, and particularly those influenced by liberal ideology. But again, now there were certain sections of society who felt that these laws were made none other than by the men folk. Again, these laws were representations of the patriarchy that existed during that time. So they could not do much about in a way to make a woman feel empowered. So, throughout we see this constant tension between various sides, various point views, various perspectives. But overall, despite all the challenges that the women's movement had to go through, it developed and emerged into something that was very strong and played a significant role in empowering of the women of Indian society. So, to conclude, one can say, when I'm concluding about the Indian perspective, one can say that, today when one looks at women's movement, what comes to one's mind is various feminist scholars, women's contribution to various autonomous organizations, and participation of women along with men in popular movements. In fact, it is for this Indu Agnihotri and Veena Mazumdar illustrated how the women's movement has not been static, but has been compelled to respond to changing political, social, economic and other national realities. Interestingly, like I stated, despite several differences, all the women's movement came together collectively to raise a single voice on various issues like wages, legal rights, law reform, sexual harassment at the workplace. Further, women's position in the society is changing with each passing time. Now let us look at women's movement in the world. So here I had spoken about women's movement in India. I would also give you a brief about how women's movement developed in the world. So during in the Western world, when one looks at the Western world, in the 18th century, one notices concepts like Enlightenment and French Revolution. That was an important event taking place. So what was Enlightenment? As we all know, Enlightenment was to make oneself feel empowered, the rational existence, the sense of equality. In the same way, the French Revolution also promoted these ideas strongly. In England, one notices the famous writer Mary Wollstonecraft writing a vindication of the rights of women, and the German Theodor Hippel published on the work that on the civil improvement of women in 1794. Now, what one notices is that these were few events that took place which initiated the progress for women to feel empowered. But however, there were certain aspects like the French Constitution of 1792 banned women from public sphere. Similarly, Napoleon's Civil Code of 1804 was implemented in most of Europe. Now, what one notices is that several changes began to take place by 19th century. These changes, as I have shown in the figure, can clearly speak about how the women movement, how it began, a sense of make the women feel empowerment. So let us trace this sense of empowerment, which was spread throughout the world, throughout the European and the American areas. So in 1848, one notices Seneca Falls Convention, which was an important event that took place when it came in relation to women in the United States. 1858 and 59, various women's pressure groups under the leadership of Barbara Leigh Smith and Bessie Rennes Parks, whose associates were called the Ladies of Langham Place, came into being. This happened in Britain. In Denmark, 1879-71, Women's Association came into existence. 1873 saw Association of Married Women from Sweden commenced. 1884, Association for the Promotion of Women's Interest began in Norway. 1884, similarly in Finland, saw Women's Association coming into place. So, 19th century was a very significant period during which efforts were made to bring together, a collective effort was made to bring together the women and raise the issues that were being faced by them. Now, now I would like to speak about the various waves which one notices that existed in the world. In a generalized sense, when one looks at women's movement in the world, one sees three waves. The first wave of feminism happened in 19th and early 20th century. The second is believed to be from 1960s to 1970s, and the third can be traced back to 1990s. Now, what was happening in the first wave of feminism, I have portrayed it in the slides that I'm talking about right now, where I'm talking about all the three waves, and I'm talking about what actually happened in it. Originally, it focused on promotion of equal contract and property rights for women. Now, the second thing that it spoke about was opposition to chattel marriage, and third aspect which the first wave of feminism spoke about was ownership of married women by their husbands. By the end of the 19th century, the focus shifted towards gaining political power, particularly the rights of women's suffrage. Now, another important aspect to be noted here is that the term first wave of feminism came into existence retrospectively in fact, after the second wave of feminism came into existence to differentiate between the two. Now, what was the second wave of feminism? If the first wave of feminism spoke about women's suffrage rights, it had more to do with the political inequalities and the economic inequalities faced by women. The second phase, in a generalized sense, was more about the private inequalities, the specific inequalities that was being faced. In fact, author Carol Hanisch famously coined the slogan, "The personal is political," which immediately became associated with the second wave. Third wave arose in 1990s. It focuses on micropolitics, and in fact, this became important because this wave was it's something that differed it from other waves because it began to include diversity of women belonging to various races, various castes, religions, nationalities, ethnicities, and this also focused on queer, the concept of queer and non-white women. Now, before I end, I would like to end with a famous quote which speaks about how today women's movement have brought about a change in the society. And this is how it goes. Betty Friedan famously wrote, "What used to be the feminist agenda is now an everyday reality. The way women look at themselves, the way other people look at women is completely different than it was 30 years ago. Our daughters grow up with same possibilities as our sons." So students, in today's session and the previous session, I discussed as much as I could in a way to make you all understand how the women's movement progressed, how it originated, how the debates that were associated in the women's movement came into being, and what the Indian women's movement was about, and what the women's movement in the world was about. Thank you, students, and we will meet in the next session.
With this note, we would like to thank Ms. Anaya Chaudhary for giving us a very, very productive session. Dear friends, for your feedback, you can mail us at info.cc@nic.in. We would be meeting again very soon. Till then, take care. Goodbye.